was the royal wedding of the century. The Prince and Princess of Wales were to be married at St Paul's Cathedral. They hoped it would save the monarchy. Instead, it led to death, divorce, and disaster. No, it's not yet another programme on Charles and Diana, as you think. Instead, it's the story of King Henry VIII, who came here on the 14th of November, 1501, to escort Katherine of Aragon to her marriage with his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. This is Henry VIII, as we all remember him. Fat, bloated, tyrannical. What Charles Dickens called a spot of blood and grease on the history of England. But this is the old Henry. There's another Henry, the one that we've forgotten. How does the young Henry become the horrible, older Henry? And to answer this question, we're going to do what no one has done before and go off in search of the boyhood of Henry VIII. We'll also find out that the international pressures on Henry aren't all that different from those faced by our government today, as it seeks to assume a leading role in Europe in the face of a much larger France and Germany. And we'll discover too that even the family life of Henry VIII isn't all that different from our own dear, dysfunctional House of Windsor today, which is why we'll see almost as much of the 20th century as of the 16th. Oh, by the way, unlike the rest of this series, the following few minutes contain no sex and hardly any violence. Nevertheless, as background to what follows, they're useful, nay, essential. Drive on. The portrait on the English playing card is said to be that of Henry VIII's mother, Elizabeth of York, the Tudor Queen of Hearts. Elizabeth of York is the first English woman whose appearance we know precisely. This is not because of this rather conventional portrait here, but because of the effigy that was made for her funeral. The head of the effigy shows a handsome English rose-style face, but it's the body which is really amazing. This shows a tall, athletically built woman measuring something like 5 feet 11.5 inches. Tall now, astonishingly tall then. But then her father, Edward IV, was even bigger. His skeleton, buried at Windsor, was measured in the 18th century and found to be 6 foot 3.5 inches tall. This height, which is passed on to Henry VIII, is obviously genetic, but it's also due to diet. The upper classes in the late Middle Ages had something like a modern American-style diet, protein-rich, and it led to a similar gigantism. Edward IV of York had seized the throne from the feeble, decayed Henry VI of Lancaster in 1461. A decade later, he lost it briefly, but after he'd come back, he embarked on a ruthless policy of destroying all members of the rival branch of the royal house, the House of Lancaster, until only 2 survived, Lady Margaret Beaufort and her son, Henry, then Earl of Richmond, an exile in Brittany. This struggle for the crown is known as the Wars of the Roses. On and off, it lasts for 30 years. Some of the battles are long and bloody, but the worst losses are suffered not by the poor, bloody infantry, but by the close-knit group of noble families through whose veins flows the royal blood of England. And from this struggle, there emerges victorious the House of York. Edward IV himself died in 1483 and was succeeded by his little son, Edward V. But their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, usurped the throne and probably murdered his nephews in the Tower. This split Yorkist England from top to bottom, and the bulk of the political establishment sided with Henry, although of course he was Henry of Lancaster. Henry invaded England, landing at Milford Haven, and triumphed at the Battle of Bosworth. Richard III was killed, and Henry VII himself became king. The political jigsaw of England, having been broken apart, was now ready to be put back together again. The kingpiece, of course, is Henry himself, crowned in autumn 1485. At the same time, he proclaims his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, my lady the king's mother, and gives her the status of a queen dowager. A month or two later, in January 1486, Henry did what everybody had been expecting him to do all along and marries Elizabeth of York, who then becomes queen. Elizabeth, of course, is the daughter of Edward IV of York and his wife, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and she's the heiress, too, of the House of York. So Lancaster and York. We're now seeing the reuniting of those two rival factions of the royal house, represented by the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, who are now united into the Tudor Rose, red without and white within. As you can see, the jigsaw of England is beginning to come back together again.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
A great struggle was over, and the country celebrated the peace that a united royal family promised them. Down there is the site of Greenwich Palace. In the Tudor period, the palace was a red brick building, long and low, rising directly from the water. It was surrounded with green fields, rolling wooded hills, and marshes rich with waterfowl. It was also the favourite palace of Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII and mother of Henry VIII. And it was here that Henry was born on the 28th of June, 1491, a child of midsummer. But Henry was a second son. He was the spare, not the heir, and that meant that he was brought up with his sisters over there at Eltham, a neighbouring palace. And the person in charge of his upbringing was his mother, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth was a devoted family woman. She was therefore very fortunate that her marriage to Henry VII proved to be fertile and quickly. Indeed, their first child, Arthur, was born just as soon as was decent, a bare 9 months after the wedding. A couple of years later came along the second child, Margaret. Then came Henry himself, born in June 1491. And a year or two later, the little baby of the family, Mary. You can just see then that Henry grows up at the heart of a happy, united and interlocked group of family and friends. A mere 7 miles from the City of London, in the middle of a wasteland of semi-detached, is Eltham, one of the lost palaces of Tudor England. We know a surprising amount about Henry VIII's upbringing here. This is due to 2 of the rather dull documents that historians have got to make do with. One of them is an account book of Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. The other is a warrant for clothing. That's a kind of order. The account book shows that a certain lady called Elizabeth Denton was one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. The other is an order for clothing for this same lady, and it describes her as Lady Mistress of the Royal Nursery. If you put these 2 things together, it shows that the head of the Royal Nursery was one of the Queen's ladies. And that means, of course, that the Queen, over there at Greenwich much of the time, is in overall charge of the Royal Nursery here at Eltham, and is in charge, of course, of the upbringing of her second son, Henry, Duke of York. Eltham was an ideal site for the royal nursery. near enough to London for ease of contact, far enough away to be free of trouble and disease. Until he was 4 or 5, Henry was brought up by women and spent much of his time with his sisters. But he was also encouraged to take up the manly sports thought suitable for a prince. Hawking and falconry was one of the great early 16th century sports, and this is a Saker falcon equipped for the sport. He's wearing a hood. This actually stops him flying off after the prey until I actually take it off. And he can't fly because he's attached here by means of a leash to my glove. You can see he's perching on my glove when he's actually staying still, which is strong and reinforced so that the talons don't go into my flesh. He's also got a bell so that when he lands, I can trace him. And one of these set of hawk bells was given to Henry when he was a little boy. However, as a young man, he was completely uninterested in the sport. He regarded it as an activity for oldies, a bit like bowls nowadays. When Henry was about 5, male tutors were appointed and the serious business of education began. He was a bright boy and studied English, French, Latin, arithmetic, and astronomy. He also read large amounts of history, which, unlike most small boys, he seems rather to have enjoyed. And one of Henry's schoolboy textbooks has actually survived. It was specially written for him by his tutor, John Skelton, and it's dated here at Eltham on the 28th of August, 1501. It's called The Speculum Principis, that is, the mirror for a prince. And it's a kind of textbook on how to be a king, or at the very least, a great royal duke. Its opening is surprising. It says to Henry, "You can never rest easy with your status. Remember how many of your ancestors have met a horrible fate." Then he goes on to say, "You've got to do the job yourself. You can never trust counselors. They're lazy creatures." And then it finishes off with a series of resounding moral precepts, which the unfortunate little boy probably had to learn by heart.
Above all, loathe gluttony. Hear the other side. Do not be mean. Love poets. Athletes are two a penny, but scholars are rare. Peruse the chronicles, direct yourself to histories, and commit them to memory. Choose a wife for yourself and prize her always and uniquely.
Clearly, Skelton was a better poet than a prophet. In 1499, Erasmus, the great Dutch scholar and gossipy letter writer, and Thomas More, then a rising young London lawyer, came to Eltham to meet the young Henry. When Erasmus remembered this scene nearly 20 years later, he recalled that there was something regal about the behavior of Henry, even though he's a little boy. We put it differently, I think. The boy Henry was already a star.
More, after paying his respects to the boy Henry, presented him with some written papers, while I, not having expected anything of the kind, had nothing to offer. In the midst stood Prince Henry, then 9 years old. On his right was Margaret, about 11 years of age. On his left played Mary, a child of 4.
But there's something else too. As we can see from this tableau, he was brought up in a happy, united family. He was the dominant male in a household of women, himself and his sisters. He was at ease with himself, at ease with the world. Now, how does this happy, secure little boy, this brilliant, easy, confident young man, turn into the monstrous, bloated Henry VIII that we all know? Well, the answer's here too, because Henry, as an adult, never knows that secure, happy family life that he'd done here at Eltham as a child. One member of the family whom Henry never saw at Eltham was his elder brother Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur was brought up 150 miles away in the Welsh borders. Nevertheless, when Arthur married Katherine of Aragon in 1501, Henry took a leading role. The wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral, not in the Wren building we know today, but in the much larger Gothic cathedral, which stood on the same site. Much larger also was the scale of the ritual. The wedding of the present Prince of Wales was almost unpretentious in comparison. But despite being a mere escort of a happy couple, when the celebrations moved to Westminster Great Hall for the wedding ball, it was the 10-year-old Henry who stole the show. The spring of 1502 was unusually wet, even for the Welsh marches. About April, Arthur, Prince of Wales, fell dangerously ill. Within a month, he was dead. He was buried here at Worcester Cathedral after less than 6 months of marriage. Rumour had it that he died from overexertion in bed, but plague or pneumonia seems more likely. As a memorial to the lost hopes of the Tudor dynasty, a great chantry was erected over his tomb. We don't know Henry's reaction to his brother's death. It wasn't even clear whether the 11-year-old Henry were heir. However, we do know the reaction of King Henry VII. When told of his son's death, he collapsed. He was comforted by Queen Elizabeth of York, who told him, "We have other children, and we are still young enough to have more." Elizabeth did indeed quickly become pregnant, but the child, a daughter, was born prematurely and died. Within a fortnight, on her 38th birthday, Elizabeth herself was dead. Elizabeth's funeral procession to Westminster Abbey took place amongst outpourings of popular grief, comparable to those for our own Queen of Hearts. At the time of Elizabeth of York's death, Henry was aged 12, the same age as Prince Harry at the time of his mother's death. The events of 1502 and 1503 both decimated and reconstructed the royal family. First came the tragic death of Prince Arthur. He was replaced as Prince of Wales by Henry himself. And then there came the death of Henry's beloved mother, Elizabeth of York. And finally, Margaret too, Henry's elder sister, went off to become Queen of Scotland. These events marked the end of Henry's childhood. He left the royal nursery at Eltham and went upriver, past his mother's favourite palace of Greenwich, past Westminster Palace, and on to join his father Henry VII's court at Richmond. This is the site of Richmond Palace. The old palace, called Sheen, burnt out in 1497. It was rebuilt by Henry VII, lavishly as a symbol of his kingship. The name, Richmond, was the title of his father's earldom, and everywhere in the palace there were symbols of himself, particularly in the Great Hall. On either side there were statues of the kings of England, beginning with the greatest and the most mythical, Brutus and King Arthur, and they culminated by the dais in a statue of Henry VII himself, brilliant in golden armour. His son, young Henry, came here as a boy, looked up and saw that statue and thought, I don't like this. But as an impressionable teenager, Henry encountered a more sympathetic model of kingship when the Archduke Philip of the Netherlands was shipwrecked at Melcombe Regis on his way to claim his wife's kingdom of Castile. This is the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. Henry came here in 1506 to welcome the Archduke Philip on the first stage of his involuntary visit to England. Henry was only a boy of 15, but already he was mature enough to act as host and guide to one of the most important rulers of Christendom. The most important thing that Philip was shown was this, the Great Round Table of King Arthur. It actually dates from the 13th century, but in the Tudor period it was thought to be authentic, and the existence of this and other Arthurian relics were held to prove the reality of King Arthur and the fact that he really had been King of Britain. The young Henry was determined that when he became king, his court should be another Camelot, and he should be another King Arthur. Part of the entertainment laid on for the King Archduke Philip was a game of real tennis. The viewing gallery was richly carpeted and hung with tapestries, specially for the royal party. Philip came, but after a few minutes he became very bored with just watching. He threw off his rich robes, stripped to his shirt, and went down and played a match with the Marquis of Dorset. For the first time, Henry had seen a king who didn't just watch games, but joined in and won as well. But the real sport of kings was jousting. The Archduke Philip was a great jouster. He even jousted with his own father, the Emperor Maximilian. On the other hand, Henry's father, King Henry VII, never took part in the joust, and he was very reluctant to allow his only surviving son, Henry, to take part in this most dangerous of sports. Instead, he limited Henry to the kind of practice joust called riding at the ring. Henry VII was only in his late 40s, but the cares of state and illness were aging him fast. He'd become an old man overnight, the Spanish ambassador noted. Meanwhile, Prince Henry was in the first flush of his magnificent youth. Already, he was taller than his father. He was a bit like Prince William and Prince Charles. Prince Henry takes just after his grandfather, Edward IV, everybody said. And the contrast in personality between father and son was just as great as this contrast in their height. Henry VII, cold, calculating, withdrawn. His son, brilliant, ebullient, outgoing. It seems unlikely that the two of them ever got on very well. Equally, the extent of disagreement between them was exaggerated. One report even had Henry VII effectively imprisoning his son in a single room. Needless to say, it was written by a foreigner, the Spanish ambassador, and it was based on a misunderstanding of how the English court was organized. Prince Henry had his own suite of rooms behind his father's, perhaps numbering 3 or 4. He'd something like 100 servants, some imprisonment.
Not that I'm accustomed in any way to unveiling busts.
Far indeed from being imprisoned, Henry was already beginning to step into the shoes of his ailing father.
Have another drink.
Richmond was Henry VII's favourite palace, and he came here in the spring of 1509. But, as in each of the 2 previous years, he fell dangerously ill. This time, however, the illness was fatal. The puckered eyebrow of his death mask, which was actually moulded on the face of the corpse, showed that he probably died of a stroke. Whatever the cause, the king's death was kept secret for 2 or 3 days. There had been a vicious factional struggle within the king's council between the lawyers, led by Henry VII's tax gatherers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, and the churchmen and nobles. So a farce was played out. As the king's dead body lay within, one of his bedchamber servants stepped out with a broadly smiling face to usher the Archbishop of Canterbury into the room. Later, the Archbishop was to emerge, equally broadly smiling, to announce that the king was well. All this gave the churchmen and nobles time to undermine their opponents and win over Henry. Henry was brought from Richmond to the Tower, where, on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April 1509, at the age of 17 years and 10 months, he was proclaimed King Henry VIII. Thomas More caught the change of mood perfectly in one of his Latin poems.
This day is the limit of our slavery, the beginning of our freedom, the end of sadness, the source of joy. For this day consecrates a young man who is the everlasting glory of our time.
Henry VIII had gone back to his mother's policy of reuniting the nation and reuniting the royal family. It was the replacement of the Winter King with the Summer Prince. Few accessions have been greeted with greater rejoicing.
The nobility, long since at the mercy of the dregs of the population, now lifts its head. The merchant, heretofore deterred by numerous taxes, now once again ploughs the seas. All are happy.
Two people, however, were excluded from the celebrations for Henry VIII's accession. They were Sir Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, the two principal ministers of the dead king, Henry VII. Very shortly after his death, they were arrested, imprisoned in the Tower there, tried and condemned to death. Soon their place as advisors to the king would be taken by Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was born at Ipswich in Suffolk, the son of a cattle dealer. Like many another poor boy, he went to Oxford, where he won all the glittering prizes. He graduated at the astonishingly young age of 15 and became fellow and bursar of his college, Magdalen. But economy was never his strong point, and he overspent massively on the building of the great tower of his college. He left Oxford under a cloud and, like many another ambitious don, threw over academic life and went off in search of the bright lights of London and the court. Katherine of Aragon stayed on in England after the death of Prince Arthur. It was agreed that she should marry Henry. There were fears that for Henry to marry his brother's widow would be both incestuous and illegal. Now Henry swept the doubts aside. He and Catherine were married just 7 weeks into his reign and 13 days before their coronation. It was the 24th of June, 1509, Henry VIII's coronation day. Henry VIII, the summer prince, was to be crowned on Midsummer's Day with his queen, Katherine of Aragon, here at Westminster Abbey. The coronation procession with the king and the queen formed over in Westminster Hall to walk the short distance to the Abbey. Behind the couple, spectators rushed in to cut up the red cloth on which they'd walked, to take away the bits and pieces as souvenirs. Henry VIII and Catherine were crowned here in front of the high altar of the Abbey. Henry sat in St. Edward's chair and swore the traditional oaths of a King of England.
Sire, will you keep peace and godly agreement both to God, the Holy Church, the clergy, and the people?
I will keep it.
Sire, will you to your power cause law, justice, and discretion in mercy and truth to be executed in all your judgments?
I solemnly promise so to do.
His Majesty signs his declaration.
Like George VI, the last king to be crowned in England, Henry swore his oaths, and as an idealistic 17-year-old, it was certain his intention to keep them. For he was determined to live up to the highest ideals of kingship. He would be a new King Arthur, a new King Henry V.
He crowns King George VI.
In 1509, as in 1937, the Queen was crowned alongside the King.
I present unto you King George, your undoubted king.
Among 1,000 noble companions, he stands out taller than any, and he has strength worthy of his regal person. In her expression, in her countenance, there is a remarkable beauty. This blessed lady has joined to you in lasting alliance nations which are powerful. She is descended from great kings, and she will be the mother of kings as great as her ancestors. Your fruitful queen will present you with a male heir and protection in unbroken line, who shall be supported on every side.
Katherine of Aragon's badge or logo was the pomegranate. The pomegranate was a symbol of fertility, and it looked as though Thomas More's prophecy of Catherine's fruitfulness would be quickly fulfilled. On New Year's Day, 1511, Queen Katherine of Aragon was safely delivered of a little boy. He was christened Henry after his father. On the 12th of February, a great joust was held here in New Palace Yard to celebrate the birth of the prince. A complete record of the tournament was made in the form of a 60-foot-long roll. Its centerpiece shows King Henry riding a Sir Loyal Hart, breaking his lance on his opponent's helmet. Behind, sitting in her gallery, Queen Catherine enthusiastically applauds her gallant husband. But the event was an end, not a beginning. The boy died a few days later, and the palace itself burned down. No king ever lived here again. Henry's marriage with Catherine had always been as much about politics as personal relationships. It guaranteed England an alliance with Spain against the traditional enemy of France. Similarly, Henry's fascination with the pretend war of the joust was closely linked to his fascination with the real business of war, weapons and armour. By the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, the standards of English armour manufacturing were very low. This meant that all Henry's fine armours had to be imported from abroad. Now, there were practical difficulties in the way of doing this. Armour has to fit like a well-made suit. So not only did you send all Henry's exact dimensions abroad, you sent pieces of his clothing as well, just to make sure. Doublets which fitted his body, hose which fitted the leg. Now, this wasn't only practically difficult, there was a bit of humiliation about it too. Henry was having to import the stuff from abroad. He was even sending his old laundry abroad as well. The Emperor Maximilian had solved this problem by creating a royal and imperial armoury to manufacture armour, specially for the imperial court. At the beginning of Henry's reign, Maximilian sent Henry a horse armour, a bard, from the imperial armouries. Henry was profoundly impressed. The armour is stamped with the letter M for the chief craftsman, Martin van Rooyen. And Henry brought over Martin and his mate to England. And Martin became the head of a new English royal armoury. Actually, it was always called the Almain Armoury, the German armoury, because most of the armourers were actually German. And the armoury settled down in Henry's favourite palace of Greenwich. At Greenwich Palace, Henry had built a watergate jutting out into the Thames, and from his study above the watergate, he could watch the ships of his rapidly growing Royal Navy. Greenwich's position at the head of the Dover Road made it the natural starting point for the continent. And it was from here, on the 15th of June, 1513, a few days before his 22nd birthday, that Henry launched his first great invasion of France.
Since time immemorial, leaders have sought to model themselves on military heroes. Henry VIII was no exception.
Mrs. Thatcher's model was Winston Churchill. Helmut Kohl's model we're not sure about, but Henry VIII's was King Henry V.
Once more, onto the breach! Dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead!
Henry's embarkation was war as magnificent spectacle and theatre.
I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, training upon the stocks. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry! England and St. George!
The massive backstage operation of organisation and planning which an invasion required was carried out not by Henry, but by his up-and-coming new councillor, Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey had begun as a protégé of the peace party on the King's Council. But Wolsey, alert as always to Henry's real wishes, knew that Henry wanted war. So war was what Wolsey gave him. 1513, Henry VIII led the largest invasion force into France since the days of his hero, Henry V, 100 years before. It was a triumph of organisational skill. That was Wolsey's task. But it was also a triumph of political skill as well, and that was Henry's. His reconciliation of all the different interest groups at the beginning of his reign, the nobility, the church, the merchant class, that laid the foundation for the political consensus, which alone allowed for the mustering of troops and the raising of taxes. It was Henry's war, and it was to be Henry's triumph. Henry arrived in Calais, still in English possession, at the end of June 1513. Three weeks were spent mustering and organising the nearly 30,000 troops. Then Henry invaded France proper and laid siege to the town of Terouanne. He was joined by the Emperor Maximilian, who served Henry as one of his own men. The two sovereigns met in a great golden tent. Then a relieving force of French arrived, greatly superior in number to the English. Battle was joined, and the French fled, leaving behind many of their number to be taken prisoner. The battle was derisively known as the Battle of the Spurs, because the French ran away so fast. Among the victors' trophies was a member of the French royal family. He was the Duc de Longueville, and he and the French banners were sent by Henry to Queen Katherine in England. After demolishing the walls of Terouanne, Henry VIII and the Emperor Maximilian moved on to lay siege to the great French city of Tournai. It was the beginning of September, and Henry's great guns quickly gained the city's surrender. But France wasn't the only theatre of war. France's old alliance with Scotland proved stronger than marriage. Henry's elder sister Margaret had married James IV of Scotland in 1503. But when Henry invaded France 10 years later, James declared war on his brother-in-law. Henry had left Queen Catherine behind as regent and Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, as her general.
When the Earl of Surrey finally caught up with James IV of Scotland, the Scottish army was encamped on the top of Flodden Edge. The site was a natural fortress. The Earl challenged the king, "Come down from your fortress and fight me in open field, man to man." The king replied loftily, "It is not for you, as an earl, to set the terms of battle to a king." Then the Earl of Surrey moved his troops away in a feinting movement. James was caught in the trap, came down and joined in battle. The result was an absolute and total disaster for Scotland. Perhaps 10,000 men were killed, 3 bishops, a dozen earls, and King James IV of Scotland himself.
Whilst Henry was still celebrating his victory in France, he received a message from his wife, Queen Catherine, back in England.
Sir, this battle has been to your grace and all your realm the greatest honor that could be, and more that you should win all the crown of France. Thanked be God of it. My husband, I send your grace the piece of the King of Scots' coat. In this your grace shall see how I keep my promise, sending you for your banners a king's coat.
Rumour made Catherine's words even blunter. She was supposed to have told Henry,
in return for a French duke, I send you the body of a dead king.
Everybody benefited from the wars of 1513. The Earl of Surrey, the victor of Flodden, was made Duke of Norfolk. Charles Brandon, Henry's jousting companion, who had also accompanied him to the Battle of the Spurs, was made Duke of Suffolk. But the real beneficiary was Henry himself. England had joined the European top table at last. These two victories transformed the international situation. Now, the last time, of course, that England was involved in a major European war was in 1939 to 45 in the Second World War. The Second World War was planned and organised here in the Cabinet War Rooms, which, incidentally, are under the sports complex of Henry VIII's great palace of Whitehall. In 1513 to 14, the international situation was both very different and very similar. Here is England. Here is England's chief enemy, France, ruled by King Louis XII. England's conquests of Terouanne and Tournai are here, just behind Calais. Now, in the war, England had had two main allies. King Ferdinand of Aragon, who rules the whole of what we call Spain, here, and across here, the Emperor Maximilian, main lands in Austria, but effectively dominating the whole of this region there. And finally, there is little Charles. He's the grandson of Maximilian. He's also the grandson of Ferdinand, and he's the nominal ruler of this very rich and important territory of the Netherlands. And the symbol of this triangular alliance between England, the Emperor, and Ferdinand is the marriage which has been contracted but not yet carried out between Charles, still a boy, and Henry's little sister, Mary. In fact, England's allies decide that they've actually done very well out of the war and they can pull out. Henry learned to double-cross with the best, and he entered into a secret peace treaty with France.
They reckoned Britain had pulled a bit of a fast one.
Henry was learning that honesty and straightforwardness had little place in international affairs. So, whilst appearing all sweetness and light to his perfidious allies, Henry was busy repudiating the engagement between Charles and his younger sister Mary, and arranging instead her betrothal to King Louis XII of France. Mary, the pretty young teenager. Louis XII, well, aged 52, decrepit, ailing, and extraordinarily ugly. Paris was en fête for its new queen. Mary had come to France to be married to Louis XII in October 1513. The marriage took place at Abbeville. She was crowned Queen of France at Saint-Denis, and then she made a state entrance into Paris. There were pageants everywhere in the city, culminating in a great religious service here at Notre Dame. Louis was enthusiastic over his new pretty bride. One account describes him as slavering. Mary's reaction is unknown. What is known is Mary's enthusiasm for the company of Henry's close friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. As part of the wedding celebrations, a great joust was held in honor of Mary, the new Queen of France. The star of the event was Charles Brandon. He was the principal English jouster. In the joust, he carried everything before him. The Dauphin of France, Francis, injured his hand and had to withdraw. Instead, He substituted for himself a gigantic German who took on Charles Brandon. Brandon dealt with him too, finally settling his hash by grabbing hold of his neck and beating him over the head with a sword until his nose bled. After only a few months of marriage, Louis XII died in the winter of 1514. For her part, Mary was so appalled at the prospect of another diplomatic marriage to an aged man like Louis that she instructed Charles Brandon to marry her in secret. A secret marriage to the king's sister was virtually treason. However, Charles Brandon was Henry's favourite, and he'd always had a soft spot for his younger sister Mary. So, after an initial show of reluctance, the king approved the marriage. He took good care, however, to strip Mary of the best of the jewels that she'd acquired as ex-Queen of France. But Henry VIII had a major problem in intervening in European politics. In comparison with the two really big European powers, France and the German Habsburg Empire, England was actually quite a small country. Let's do the direct comparison between France, England's major neighbour, and England itself. In terms of size, England is only the quarter the size of France. In terms of population, the difference is even greater. England is actually a fifth the size of France, 2.75 million people, as opposed to the 15 million of Francis I. And in terms of royal revenue, the contrast is even greater. Henry VIII has a tenth of the revenues of Francis I. In other words, when Henry VIII manages to make England one of the European big three, he's punching above England's weight, if not his own.
And you can see part 2 of David Starkey's profile of King Henry VIII at the same time tomorrow.